Chinatown gang watchers say the shootout at the cemetery was thought out by the Chinese ghost shadows as being the ultimate insult to the Vietnamese gang known as Born to Kill, VTK for short. 3 gunmen, masquerading as mourners, suddenly dropping their flowers, loosing a volley of shots at the cortege, wounding 7.
If you look at our newspapers today, literally today, or yesterday, or the day before yesterday, you'll see terrible problems in the Chinese American community involving gangs and violence and organized criminal activity. The story of crime in America is the Mafia. Nonsense. If there were no Mafia, had never been a Mafia, had never been even an Italian immigration into the United States, we'd be a much poorer country if we hadn't had an Italian immigration into the United States, but we would still have crime, perhaps more, perhaps less, but just about the same. You wouldn't be able to measure the difference.
I went to study the dropout rate from high schools of Italian Americans in New York. It was the same as blacks and Puerto Ricans, because teachers were saying to them, "You're Italian, why don't you get a job as a sanitation man?" You know, the self-esteem that you need to say, "I can be president of the United States," wasn't there. There was no Mario Cuomo, there was no Francis Coppola, there was no Marty Scorsese. There were athletes and singers. It was Joe DiMaggio or Frank Sinatra or Al Capone, you know? And it was easier to be Al Capone. You needed less talent, you know?
I think what happened with regard to La Cosa Nostra, the Mafia, and the connection and sometimes the overemphasis of Italian or Italian-American organized crime, probably it's a function of 2 things. One, the movies. The Godfather and movies like that, particularly The Godfather, which was a great American movie, and now 3 movies, has created a broad picture that organized crime somehow uniquely involves Italians and Italian-Americans. The second thing is that it is true that for a long period of time, particularly in the 50s and the 60s into the 70s, maybe even into the early 80s, La Cosa Nostra, the Mafia, was the most successful of all of those earlier organized crime groups.
Cosa Nostra is a strictly American organization. It developed in response to American culture. It is uniquely a product of the history of that time and that place and that culture, and therefore was able to take within it the different secret societies from the older country and also just criminals who had no relationship to them.
La Cosa Nostra broke out of the Italian community and started becoming Americanized. It was much easier for them to do that than the Chinese. The Chinese basically remained within the Chinese communities in the United States. Additionally, Prohibition helped very much for the American La Cosa Nostra to develop itself to the point it is today. That Prohibition enabled all the American La Cosa Nostra to what became the La Cosa Nostra. It enabled them to be involved in one type of illegal activity, the illegal smuggling of liquor into and within the United States, so that they had to establish lines of communication and cooperation with each other throughout the United States. That, and then they had various wars. They were fighting off other gangs, Irish gangs or Purple Gang or various gangs throughout the United States. And their history that goes back 300 years and the structure that they had and the code of silence that they had, plus their cooperative endeavors, helped them to basically overcome all the other gang influence. Then in New York, you had the Castall
Marese War.
Yeah.
But we didn't know that history of 1930 and 31 until VALACHI explained it to us. He was the man who explained the Castall Marese War. He told us when he first heard of this new organization. VALACHI was Napolitano, and he was told in prison, oh, they're all going to get together. Napolitani, Siciliani, Calabrese, tutte insieme. He said, no, mai successe. But it did.
Well, when did you become a member of this organization?
1930.
1930. What is the name of it? It is
Cosa Nostra in Italian.
Cosa Nostra in Italian.
Our thing and our family in English.
Our thing and our family in English.
Can you tell me your name?
Joe.
Joe and?
That's you don't need my last name.
Okay, Joe. Why do you know all the history and who told you and how you were involved in all this story?
Okay, I had a good friend, Jiggs Filano, and I met him in Atlanta, and we were very close. He was a Colombo captain, and Jiggs was close to VALACHI, and he knew all these people. So Jiggs knew about these incidents that happened.
Jiggs belongs to Maranzano or Masseria faction?
Maranzano. So from Maranzano, he went to Profaci, and but that comes later.
Yeah.
So
what occasion you met Fulani?
Well, I met him in the prison, and then after I got out of prison, I knew him before anyway, and we were friends,
And Mr. Fulani is still alive?
No.
Are you sure?
No, I'm not sure. I don't know. I would think so, but maybe he is.
Okay. So if he's still alive, how old is going to be now?
About 83, 84, like that.
So Mr. Fulano met all these people that we're going to talk now?
Yes.
He is my, what you call, godfather. Then he picks your finger.
Who?
The godfather.
He picks your
He
finger.
picks your finger with a needle. Makes a little blood come out. In other words, that's to express the blood relation. Supposed to be like brothers.
That's the letting of blood.
That's right. That you live by the gun and by the knife, and you die by the gun and by the knife. That's what I'm telling you now. I need to go no further to say nothing else. This is what I'm telling you, what I'm exposing to you and the press and everybody. This is my doom.
Joe VALACHI, he was a very, very interesting man with a fantastic memory. He realized that the bosses took all the money and the troops didn't get a break. He also was bitter against Vito Genovese because Vito Genovese wanted him killed in the prison, and they tried to kill him. When you're dealing with a man like this, you have to be very, very careful that you check whether he's telling the truth or not.
The killing of Joe Masseria by the Maranzano group, and then the development of the American Cosa Nostra as established originally by Maranzano, and then the killing of Maranzano and the rise of importance of Lucky Luciano, I believe basically brought the American Cosa Nostra into the 20th century.
So Maranzano turns around and starts killing Joe the Boss's guys. And vice versa. Joe the Boss starts killing Maranzano's guys. Before you know it, 70, 80, maybe more. $70 or 80, maybe more, maybe less, but this is what I was told. There was a lot of killings. They're buried all over. Some of them they left on the streets, but some of them they didn't want found. They buried them in the Catskills Mountains.
Yeah, it's close to New York.
Yeah, it's upstate New York. There's a lot of bodies, a lot of burial grounds out there. And the mob guys had, all over. And off the Sawmill River Parkway, And so what happens was the cops start getting all these bodies all around and everything, right? They get in touch with Maranzano and Masseria, Joe the Boss, and they tell him, look, stop the killing, or you're going to have problems of your own. We're going to lock you both up, shut you down. Because everybody, Joe the Boss was paying off cops, and Maranzano was paying off cops, so they turned their head every time. But the big shots, they wanted to stop,
These men who did not have a formal education picked some very nice words. They didn't say we're a gang of gangsters. What did they say? Una familia. We are a family. They didn't say, I'm the big boss and you better do it. The old man, you know, the father, the godfather, all right? They didn't say, if you don't do what we tell you, we'll kill you. They say, when you're in the family, you've got to have respect for the leaders, for the father figure, okay? So they were very smart, even though they did not have a formal education. But if you take a good look at the history, and this is where I put the blame on the media, the history is there. History is there. This was not a group of friends all together one for one. From 1930 right up till they killed Paul Castellano 4 years ago, they're all killing one another, plotting against one another, stealing from one another, and the evidence is there, but the media never picked it up and said, you know, this story is a myth. They're all together. They're double-crossing and killing one another for 50 years.
What happened was Luciano, who was like neutral in this, you know, balance, yeah, where Joe the Boss didn't know nothing about Luciano being very close to Maranzano. So Luciano set it up through Lansky and Maranzano that he's going to invite Joe the Boss out for a dinner. They go to this restaurant, they sit down, they're talking, they're drinking, they're eating, they're having a good time, you know, laughing, and it comes time for the espresso. So Luciano says to the waiter, he says, bring us a nice espresso with some anisette, a bottle of anisette, and bring me the check, I want the check. Then there was a little, not argument, but the Joe was, no, this is on me. You know, they had too much drink. No, this is on me. No, you're my guest. He says, that's all right. It's on me. I'm Joe the Boss. I'm going to pay the check. So Luciano says, okay. Excuse out. I got to go to the bathroom. Like this. Okay. In the meantime, the waiter's bringing the espresso and anisette over. And as Luciano gets up from the table, he winks at the guy sitting at the table, gives him the signal. The guy gives a signal to the people in the car. Luciano goes in the bathroom. This is all quick, like, you know, I'm talking tongue slow, but it's all quick, like, it's all timed perfectly. He goes into the bathroom. Two of the four walk in, and they start shooting all over the place. Joe the Boss, there may be 6, 7, 8 shells in him. He fell down on the table in his own pool of blood. Luciano hears all the shots outside. He finishes, he washes his hands, comes out, he looks around, he calls the cops. Everybody was happy for a while. Luciano and Maranzano was happy, and he set himself up to be capo tutti capi. All right, that's boss of all bosses.
Maranzano formed the 5 families in New York. He created the position of capo di tutti capi, the boss of all bosses, and put himself in that position. And that was the modern mob that formed in this country.
Luciano and Maranzano were both very smart men. Maranzano gave them the foundation, and Luciano built upon that foundation. Enabled them to get into labor racketeering and to expand their type of illegal activity. And that's why they became the predominant organized crime group in the United States.
Machiavelli wrote in The Prince that when somebody becomes the boss, he ought to kill those people who supported the previous regime. And apparently Maranzano didn't take that to heart, because he allowed Luciano to live at least long enough for Luciano to kill Maranzano. Luciano had, since boyhood, been friends with Jewish gangsters, Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel, and he relied on the Jewish gangsters to do his work for him.
Maranzano had hired Mad Dog Call. That's Mad Dog Call. I don't know if you ever heard of him, right? And he was a good stone killer, you know. And he paid him a lot of money up front to come in, be sitting in his office to kill the Luciano and Genovese when they walked in. So Lansky came up with the idea to have 4 Jew hitmen come over. 4 Jewish guys in his crew would come over. They come over like federal agents, you know, because the Italians, you know, they looked Italian. They spoke broken English and everything, you know, and they wouldn't be known. You know? In the meantime, they brought 4 guys in, trained them a little bit like federal agents, like IRS guys. So Maranzano, thinking that my lawyer told me to expect the tax guys around, you know, IRS agents. So he says, I'm Maranzano. 2 of them grabbed him and says, now let's go in your office. We want to talk to you. The other 2 guys, they took all the guns off. He had a crew of 4 or 5 guys in there, bodyguards, right? The other 2 agents that went inside with Maranzano in the office, they pulled knives. And they started to choke him and stab him. But he was tough. Maranzano, you know, big and strong and tough. We started fighting him off, you know, yelling and everything. But they had to get the guns out and shoot him, kill him, right? They killed him. I don't know how many bullets they put in him, but he was dead. They ran out, and who's walking up is Mad Dog Paul. I told him what happened. He says, Maron, to me, I got paid for nothing. I'll keep it. And he took off. You know, that was the end of the Castall Marese War.
You know the name of the 4 Jewish that pretend to be the IRS people?
Well, I know one of them. One of them was Benjamin Siegel. He went under the name of Bugsy Siegel. Well, good hitman and good gangster.
Luciano then took over, and he really had the support at that time of the people who made up the mob, because Maranzano had not done himself any good by giving himself the title of boss of all bosses. The others were jealous, and they sought a new way of organizing Cosa Nostra.
Luciano looked at it, you know, that he was the smartest one and he could set everybody up, but he said to everyone, there will be nobody a top boss of bosses anymore. We're going to divide this into 5 families, 5 different families. And he said, Bocacci, you're one family. Gagliano was another family. Mangano was a family. Luciano naturally was his family. And Bonanno, Joe Bonanno.
Each family was headed by a boss who had an underboss and a consigliere later designed by Luciano. There were captains, either capo regime, capo di Sena, depending upon who you listen to and who you believe. And within each crew of a capo regime, there were soldiers. The soldier would make money as a result of those criminal activities and pass a portion of that money up to the captain, and then it would be sent up to the underboss and the boss.
The Mafia made a decision in the United States back in the 30s that it didn't make sense to kill public officials. So what the Mafia has spent its time concentrating on in America is killing witnesses, not killing the prosecutor or the government official. And in fact, it's a terrible thing to say, but from the point of view of business, they made the right decision. I mean, the witness is invaluable. You can't prosecute without the witness.
In the 1930s, Luciano was convicted of compulsory prostitution by Tom Dewey, the famous rackets buster in New York County, and went to prison for 90 years.
Ends the luck of Charlie Lucky Luciano. Shackled to his henchmen, the overlord of a $12 million a year vice ring goes to prison for from 30 to 50 years. Justice Philip J. McCook, whose stern sentences struck terror into the underworld. At Sing Sing, the droopy-eyed gang leader gets his last glimpse of the outside world for many years. When he comes out, he'll be an old man. New York's big shot is now just prisoner number 92168. The lowest form of racketeering has been given a death blow, and Lucky is lucky no more.
The mob at that time was involved in a variety of industrial racketeering. And they, through Sox Lanza, controlled the piers in New York. Indeed, they still do to this very day. There was concern, of course, during World War II that there would be sabotage on the piers, and as a result, U-boats would be able to move in offshore and attack the American mainland. The War Department was very concerned that it had control over the piers and that it had people on the piers that were reliable and would support the American side in the war. And they recognized that the best way to do that was to do it through the mob, Cosa Nostra, that controlled those piers. And as a result, through the auspices of Tom Dewey, they worked out an arrangement where Luciano would give the okay, the authorization to Lanza to have the piers work on behalf of U.S. interests, in return for which Luciano was paroled, pardoned, and he was deported to Italy.
The story with Lucky Luciano and the government Navy intelligence was he was going to help them save the war. The proof is the United States government got nothing, and Luciano had visits from all his friends in jail. He could run his boat, and then he got let out and said, organized crime fooled the government.
I don't think there's any contradiction in what Thomas Dewey did. As district attorney, he fought for the conviction of a major underworld figure, convicted him and sent him to prison for 90 years based upon changes in the law and a very strong and effective prosecution. And when he realized during the war that it was important that an accommodation be reached for a short period of time with the mob, and in exchange for that, Luciano would be pardoned and deported, it seemed like a reasonable approach to make, an accommodation to reach.
Lucky Luciano was the boss of that family, and he went to prison in 1936. He was in prison, but he's still the boss. The underboss was Vito Genovese, all right? Don Vitone. But he got indicted in a murder case around 1940-41, and he fled to Italy. So the boss is in prison. The underboss went away to Italy. The man who was in charge on the streets of New York was Frank Costello, okay?
While he's in New York, a couple of years later, I think it was 1937, as Jiggs told me, that a stool pigeon that was in jail knew of a few murders that Vito Genovese committed. And he knew where the bodies were and everything, because Vito used them. And everybody's looking to make deals with himself and everything, you know? And so, you know, to get out of prison. So Vito Genovese finds out what's going on. Gets over $1 million in a suitcase, and he goes back to Italy. He gets close with Mussolini.
He made some very substantial gifts to Mussolini's party, and he was made commendatore the something or other, and he was very, very comfortable.
He gives Mussolini about $300,000 to start a fascist club. Fascist, Gavish fascist. And Mussolini was so happy and so overjoyed, he made Vito Genovese the commandante, commander. Commendatore, yeah. And he meets Mussolini's son-in-law, Ciano. And Ciano, Vito Genovese introduced him to cocaine, and Chano loved it. You know, it was a high. Cocaine is, you feel beautiful when you get good cocaine. And so Chano got hooked on it. So Mussolini fed him. You know, didn't ask him for money, just took care of him. In the meantime, Chano hooked him up with the supply.
Then when Mussolini fell out of power and the American troops came, he talked to an American politician who was in charge of the military government, and he made him an interpreter. So he went from Mussolini's party to the American Army employee interpreter, and he started a black market there with trucks and things like that. He was making money very easily. He was arrested. When the witness against him was poisoned in Brooklyn, and there's no more case, then the military government said, wait, we got the transportation, take him right back, and they brought him back, and there was no more case in Brooklyn.
Genovese now, after the war, found that he could come back to the United States, but ran into the problem of Costello now not wanting to give up power. Chin Gigante, on Genovese's behalf, took a shot at Costello in the lobby of his apartment house, just wounding him. But presumably that wounding was enough. Costello relinquished his role as head of the family, and Genovese once again assumed power.
In the meantime, everybody's worried that this rally, he's getting guys going to the electric chair. I mean, he's a Class A stool pigeon.
Abe Relis was a witness who was going to testify against various individuals in Murder Incorporated. He was kept as a protected witness in a hotel room in Brooklyn, the Half Moon Hotel. A number of police officers were guarding him, and Relis was found outside the window, many stories down, dead.
He got all dressed, and they hit him over the head. They killed him in the room, the two cops, and they tied a couple of sheets together. They threw it out the window. I think he was on the 6th floor, 5th or 6th floor. And there was an embankment before you get to the floor. There was a concrete embankment. They threw him head first out the window. So, you know, it wouldn't look like he was killed. And that was the end of him.
The official result of the investigation was that he tried to escape and fell from the window. But there is no one that I know who has looked at the incident who believes that's what happened. But there was no question at the time that one of the major strengths of the mob was their ability to corrupt legitimate government, whether it be in the legislative branch, whether it be in the judicial branch, and certainly in the police department.
When you consider that Frank Costello once controlled both the Democratic and Republican bosses of Manhattan, he was intelligent and sort of knew how to conciliate people. His wife was Jewish, so he was one of the guys that, and he spoke some Yiddish, so he helped bring the Italians and the Jews together in a way that made it kind of intelligent, you know, breakdown of what this business was. And he saw it as a business, as did Lansky. In those days, the old days, not long ago, we're talking, you know, in my lifetime, judges were made by Frank Costello. He would pick a guy and said, you're going to be a judge. And they would make him a judge.
Luciano in 46 was sent back to Italy, and Costello was the boss of the family. And Genovese was very angry about that. He thought he should have been the boss. And here's Costello the boss, and he's down below. And that aggravated him for 10 years. In 1957, he approached Carlo Gambino and said, you know, the leader of your family is this Albert Anastasia. He's a crazy man. He wants to kill everybody. It would be nice if we could get rid of Albert Anastasia and Frank Costello, and I'll take over this family and you take over that family. And it would be nice, too, because your son, Tommy, is married to the daughter of Mr. Lucchese. It'd be nice if the three of us were together. So Carlo Gambino said, fine, we're all together. You make the first move. So in July of 1957, Frank Costello was coming home, and he got shot, and the bullet creased his head, and he got the message. He said, I'm retired. So Genovese is going to take over. Some of Costello's friends, including Albert Anastasia, were not too happy. And Genovese said to Gambino, okay, your move next. And in October, they killed Albert Anastasia, and Gambino moved up.
There are different explanations for the reason of his killing. One was he was involved in the selling of memberships to the mob with his underboss Scalise, who was also killed. But there are probably many reasons for it, and also many suspects in the killing. Some believe it was Joey Gallo and his brothers. Others believe it were others involved, but certainly it was from people within the mob. And then mobsters from all over the country met at the home of Joseph Barbera to settle out a series of problems. Again, depending upon who you believe, it involved the trafficking in narcotics, the killing of Anastasia, union problems, but a series of issues within the mob that called for a national conclave. Unfortunately for them, a state police officer by the name of Edgar Crosswell noticed a large number of figures meeting at this rural home.
Among the gangsters attending the convention were Santos Trafficante, Joe Bonanno, Joe Profacci, Carlo Gambino, Vito Genovese, Sax Lanza, Carmine Galante, Joe Mariocco, Stefano Magadino.
They gave dozens of reasons for being there, many the same, many different. And as a result of what was obviously lying before the grand jury, were indicted for conspiracy to commit perjury. But for a variety of legal reasons and legitimate ones, the indictment was dismissed. But now the nation's attention was focused on the mob, and for the first time, the FBI recognized that there was something there.
There has been expressed criticism of the FBI for not being involved in organized crime investigations until 1957. Now, as you know, it was the Appalachian New York Conference in 1957 and the wide publicity that it received that got the FBI involved in investigation. It wasn't until that time that basically the federal government really knew that there was a criminal group operating in the United States, throughout the United States, that involved in day-to-day criminal activity.
And remember, before that, J. Edgar Hoover never did anything about the mob. Nothing, ever. He was too busy chasing some guy that was a communist for 18 minutes in 1933. Then, you know, I remember Woody Allen one time wrote a story that started off, that said something like, Jimmy Baby Blue Eyes Alloy was indicted yesterday for illegal possession of New Jersey. You know? But that's what was happening at the period. You know, while Hoover was chasing communists, gangsters were like taking over entire cities, you know, and creating, you know, taking over the politics of places like New Jersey. The theory always was they had something on Hoover, which probably was true.
There are two major theories, and of course, the answer to which one is correct lies in the head of Hoover, and Hoover's dead, so we will never know, of why Hoover, as head of the major national law enforcement agency, refused to recognize the existence of the mob. Some say it was because his major focus was communism, and to the extent that concentration on the mob would dilute that effort, he was opposed to it. The other is somewhat more charitable and maybe more correct. He knew that the mob was involved in a variety of activities that provided services that the public wanted, gambling and loan sharking, and that there was a great deal of corruption which accompanied these kind of activities. And the FBI up to that point had an extraordinarily good image. To the extent that there was any corruption, it was minor and not systemic. And many believe that he did not want to have the FBI get involved in the kind of activities which would make them susceptible to corruption as other police departments around the country.
David, I'd like to know what your impressions have been in the studies that you've carried on in New York.
We went to the prison of New York City, and I saw men behind bars. And the other fellows agree with me that crime does not pay.
Well, Jack, what do you got to say for yourself?
I'm so short I'll have to get up on the box.
All right, Jack on the box. Let us know what you know about crime and about the conditions in New York.
Gee, Mr. Hoover, your G-men sure are good. I'd like to be one when I grow up.
Well, Jack, if you continue to work hard, play hard, and live clean, we'll be mighty proud to have you as a G-man.
Hoover said the Mafia doesn't exist because he didn't want his agents to get near the Mafia because he knew the Mafia would bribe his agents. And he wanted his agents to be as pure as the purest of priests in the Vatican. This was his agents. So he didn't have them out combating any crime. No, I just refuse to believe that they are nearly as important as they are put out to be.
Excuse us, please. Will you give us some room, please, to get through?
In my opinion, in New York, the five families are very strong, still to this day. And I don't want to call them ghosts, because they're not ghosts. They're there, they're real, they're active. In the 1950s, what happened was the various heads of the families throughout the country decided that they would prohibit drug trafficking by all the Cosa Nostra members. And they would allow the Sicilian Mafia to bring drugs into the United States and distribute the heroin within the United States. Part of the meeting in 1957 in Appalachian, New York, was to discuss this and coordinate this. It was basically in 1957 that they came out with the prohibition of American La Cosa Nostra dealing in drugs. If you go back and look at the individuals before that, a number of American La Cosa Nostra members were convicted of drug trafficking violations.
A lot of agents and policemen made long, illustrious careers for themselves by becoming Mafia experts. And they sat in their offices and conducted courses in what I call Italian geography. They would say that Mr. Gotti went to lunch here, then he went to dinner here. They had the locations of restaurants. Nonsense.
On September 22nd, 1966, the National Commission of La Cosa Nostra had a meeting. I don't know where, but they had a meeting.
You're positive?
Positive. The next day, they had it on the 21st. The next day, 13 people, Carlo Gambino, Michele Miranda, who was minding the family, Tommy Eberly, Joe Colombo, Santo Trafficante, Carlos Marcello and his brother, and two other men from New Orleans. They all came to New York City and they were having lunch. And my office locked them up. Okay. They were held on bail as material witnesses. They put up $100,000 each, $1.3 million bail. A Stella Restaurant. And they were given 2 weeks, get a lawyer, talk to your lawyer, because you've got to come back to the grand jury. When they came back 2 weeks later, and they appeared in the court, at the noon recess, a newspaper man went up to Trafficante and says, was this another Appalachian meeting? He said, what are you talking about? We were just having a meal in a very nice restaurant. We're going back again. Why don't you come with us? So the four from Louisiana and Santo Trafficante and two attorneys, one representing Trafficante, the other representing Louisianans, went back to La Stella Restaurant. And the reporters followed them. They said, you're going to be in trouble. So you come here and you eat, you sit near us, they're going to say it's an Appalachian meeting. One reporter said, do you mind if we take a picture? Take a picture. And Trafficante has got a glass of wine, and he's holding it right up into the camera, he's toasting it and everything else. And the newspapers published it. Time magazine has the picture, and the only written words are, alleged mafiosi who ate at La Stella restaurant returned 2 weeks later to have clams at the Summit.
I mean, the families all had this policies that that members cannot deal in drugs. Like some of the families had policies where you cannot deal in drugs, you cannot lend money to a drug dealer, but you can shake them down. But a lot of these rules fell by the wayside, and family members were involved with drugs. The bosses of the families had a see no evil, hear no evil approach to it. And especially some of the larger New York families, the Colombo family, Bonanno family, they got heavily involved in drugs. You'll see it a lot less with the Genovese family. There might be some activity, but it is much less. The problem is it's way too lucrative. There's no way for the Mafia to have avoided getting involved in drugs, or they would have lost their control over organized crime in the country.
The organized crime knows very well, sa benissimo cosa succede.
Organized crime knows exactly what's going on, especially the bosses. The bosses say they don't want to be involved with drugs, but they take the money, and how?
Noi di droga non ne vogliamo sapere, però I soldi se li pigliano, e come se li pigliano?
E chi sono le famiglie più involve in questo?
And who are the families that are more involved in this business? Well, let's say that the Bonanno family, they have about a 90% involvement. The Gambino family, a 70% involvement. The Genovese, just about 30%. But the Gambino family, and above all the Bonannos, they're involved down to their bones, from the small to the big ones. I know for a certainty that many of these mafiosi are involved. In the Bonanno family, there's a lot of involvement. That's why they rubbed that Galante. Because Galante, along with his associates, he didn't give to the Americans what they wanted. That's why they rubbed them out. But if you look at the Bonanno family, you see that they're all involved in drugs. They're involved above all in heroin.
Tutti, vedi, se tu guardi Court Pepper, guardi che tutti nella famiglia Bonanno, per un livello o un altro, sono tutti involti in drugs, soprattutto l'eroina.
All roads lead to Hollywood, or so it seems. Thousands of people come to the motion picture capital each year to see the sights. And the famous names of famous places are as well known to your Aunt Minnie as the grocery store back home. Once here, most every first-time visitor expects to drive along the boulevards or stroll up the streets and see a motion picture star face to face, though some are content just to see their footprints firmly set in cement. But whether or not you've ever visited Hollywood, we're going to take you behind the scenes for what should prove an unusual experience.
2024, take 2. All set. 1. Go, come on, go.
We know about murder and hate and love and jealousy and sex, so all of that, plus not being involved in it at all, you know, you can really, so as much as we might admire the nuclear physicist, it wouldn't be as exciting as watching the gangsters. And it's a visual. You can see somebody getting shot and dying or making love, whereas you really wouldn't want to watch in a pharmacy, in a lab, testing atom bombs or something like that. You know, I don't think it's a mystery why we find the gangster movies exciting.
Mr. DeMille, all ready to go. You're seeing a great movement, a great sweeping forward of these men who are leaving you, perhaps for all time. They're your fathers, your brothers, your husbands. Let me see that in your faces. Come on now, work yourselves into the emotion of such a scene. Don't be extras. Be a nation watching its manhood ride out on a great cause. The crusade. Are you ready, Tate?
Already and turning, Mr. DeMille.
All right, now, give me everything you've got, you people. Ready now? Right? Come on, come up to it now.
Speed, 957.
Places, everybody. This is a take. Clear the set. Right? Camera.
Everything's okay.
The facts of this case concern the activities of an underworld group which kidnapped not only a powerful American labor union, the International Alliance of Theatrical Stage Employees, commonly known as IATSE, but the entire motion picture industry of the United States. This gang controlled, it exploited, and it extorted an industry from the moment of production of films in Hollywood to the moment of exhibition in each and every theater in America.
So they found out that Brown had the power. And so they went to Bayoff. And Bayoff went over to the mob and told Brown what he had to do. Well, as I say, Brown was essentially a trade unionist, but he was vulnerable, and he was resisting it. And one day, he found 3 sticks of dynamite tied to the door of his doorknob of his restaurant. As I say, he had a wife and 3 little girls.
Willie Bayoff and George Brown started in Chicago. They were basically working under the auspices of Barney Balaban and his operations, and Barney Balaban later became the head of Paramount Pictures. With the help of the underworld, the Bayoff and Brown syndicate was able to take over the International Alliance of Theatrical Employees Union, the IATSE. He came into Hollywood, and using Bayoff and Brown as a middleman, the Chicago Mafia was able to shake down the motion picture industry. They were forcing 8 motion picture studios to make payoffs for labor peace.
Bayoff had once been convicted as a pimp in Chicago, and Joe Skank, chairman of 20th Century Fox, had a personal transaction with Bioff involving $100,000. The Internal Revenue Service picked up this information. It investigated Joe Skink, found a tax fraud case on its own merits involving Skink. The case came to my office. He was then indicted for tax fraud. Skink went to trial. He was convicted. He got 3 years in jail. Within 30 days, he wanted to tell the government a story. He told us how the studios and theaters had been paying Bioff and Brown.
I think the producers were glad to pay them rather than pay the workers, because they paid them. If they paid the workers what the increases they demanded, that would be more than they were paying to the crime syndicate.
Once jailed, Bioff and Brown volunteered to give information with regard to their partners. This information brought indictments against Mafia characters such as Nitti, Campagna, DeAndrea, DeLucia, Maritote, Joy, and Roselli.
And I think there was about five of the major Chicago Mafia figures ended up in jail. Frank Nitti, who was among those indicted, later committed suicide. And as a consequence, the penetration of the motion picture industry continued.
Nitti went out on the prairie outside of Chicago, and he waited for a freight train to come by slowly outside of Riverside, Illinois. The train crew watched a seemingly drunken man weaving and half falling, and then they saw him whip out a revolver. He placed the gun against his temple and blew off his head.
And in my view, after Bioff was sent to jail, then Roy Brewer came here to take Bioff's place. And of course, they've always claimed that with Bioff gone, there was no more
involvement of
the Chicago crime syndicate. I've never bought that.
When we got here, I said to him, 30 days, I said, look, this is not a trade union fight. This is a fight between the communists and the trade unions. And I said, either we're going to lick them or they're going to lick us. And because if we compromise, that's their game. They take a little, then they back off, then they take a little more. And I said, the only way we're going to succeed is to take them on.
Willie Bob moved to Arizona and assumed a new identity. As I recall, it was George Nelson. And he lived in some suburb of Arizona. And this is some 3 or 4 years after the trial. He walked out, got into his car, and the car blew up. Apparently, dynamited, he was killed. George Brown simply disappeared off my radar screen. I've never seen or heard from him or heard anything about him ever since.
Actually, the relationship among studio heads and the Mafia existed long before the Bioff and Brown situation evolved in the late 1930s. I mean, when Jack Warner and his brothers came to Hollywood and formed Warner Brothers, they had enormous connections with organized crime figures. Harry Cohn, who came from New York, from Columbia Pictures, had massive organized crime ties. I mean, this was not unique to the situation. It was just this one case became the embodiment of the Mafia's penetration of the film industry. And it wasn't until the late 1940s when Sid Korshak moved to Hollywood on a full-time basis that the underworld's penetration of not just unions but of business, the management levels of the studios, became much more sophisticated. we had clearly seen that Reagan's film career had reached its height during the early 1940s when he did the movie King's Row. After the success of that film, his agent, Lou Wasserman, who was at MCA, managed to pull Reagan $1 million contract from Warner Brothers Studios. But Warner Brothers ended up pigeonholing Reagan into cowboy films and B movies. And as Reagan's film career waned, he became more involved in union politics. I think in the early 1940s, he became a member of the Screen Actors Guild board, where his wife, Jane Wyman, was also a member. So Reagan stepped up and became the president of the Screen Actors Guild in 1947.
There was goodly violence when Reagan was president, and the Conference of Studio Unions was on strike and trying to represent the crafts that IATSE would not cover, including the extras, a certain union of extras. And there was a terrible tainting and labeling of communist on the leader of that conference, and Reagan carried a gun at the time, I believe, to defend himself, according to him.
He was an informant, and his brother, what's his name, Herbert, I think, or Hubert, one or the other. His brother also was admittedly a paid informant by the FBI. His job seemed to be to hide in the bushes wherever they detected one of these meetings in the house, like the one I described to you. This Reagan, his brother, would hide in the bushes and take down the license numbers of all the automobiles of the people who were attending the meetings. Report that to the FBI.
So in 1952, Reagan engaged in one of his last acts as president of the Screen Actors Guild to provide a blanket waiver permitting his talent agency, MCA, to engage in television production.
Well, Reagan cooperated a little too fully with MCA, and he allowed them to both be producer and agent. In return, they made him a millionaire. Draw your own conclusions.
My name is Ronald Reagan. Last year, the contributions of 16 million Americans to the crusade for freedom made possible the World Freedom Bell, symbol of hope and freedom to the communist-dominated peoples of Eastern Europe, and built this powerful 135,000-watt Radio Free Europe transmitter in Western Germany. The crusade for freedom is your chance and mine to fight communism. Join now by sending your contributions to General Clay, Crusade for Freedom, Empire State Building, New York City.
The damage that Reagan did was largely after his Hollywood period. The Hollywood period was a springboard for him into something bigger, the governorship of California, and then the presidency of the United States, proving that no matter how stupid and how ignorant a man is, he can hope to be president of the United States and be reelected president of the United States.
I make 5 basic allegations. Number 1, that Ronald Reagan is a creation. He is an invention of this corporation, MCA. That number 2, that as president of the Screen Actors Guild, Reagan engineered this blanket waiver on behalf of MCA, which turned MCA into a multi-billion-dollar corporation. And that is a quid pro quo. Reagan was turned into a multimillionaire.
I am paying for this microphone, Mr.
Number 3, that MCA has always maintained strong ties with major organized crime figures. Number 4, that Reagan benefited from these associations of organized crime that MCA possessed. And that finally, that as President of the United States, that Ronald Reagan's policies and appointments to public office in his administration were directly influenced by these organized crime associations of MCA. And again, the record is clear on this.
The office of President of the United States.
And will to the best of my ability.
Will to the best of my ability.
Preserve, protect, and defend.
Preserve, protect, and defend.
The Constitution of the United States.
The Constitution of the United States.
Help me God.
So help me God.
My congratulations, sir.
I don't have a very good opinion of Reagan, as you can judge. I used to think he was just a liar. I don't say that anymore because now I'm rather persuaded that Reagan really believes the lies he tells. So to him, they're not lies. He lives in a world of fantasy, just as he did when he was an actor, I think a third-rate actor.
Mary! Oh, no. You get out. You turn right around and leave.
Oh, but Mary! But he was an actor in Hollywood, and he lives in a world of fantasy. He's acting out a scenario all the time.
The charge has been made that the United States has shipped weapons to Iran as ransom payment for the release of American hostages in Lebanon, that the United States undercut its allies and secretly violated American policy against trafficking with terrorists. Those charges are utterly false.
Sometimes I wonder why I spend the lonely nights dreaming of a song. The melody haunts my reverie, and I am once again with you when our love was new.
All right, now Sinatra wanted to part in a picture called From Here to Eternity because his career was down the tubes. I mean, he was gone. They would, and Harry Cohn says, I wouldn't give that miserable so that Dago, you know.
No one really knows. We do know that Harry Cohn was a very, very powerful man. He owned Columbia Studio. We also know that there was no great love between him and Sinatra.
This is the story we get from the FBI and others. And Costello called Roselli and said, get Frank the part. Now Roselli goes and says, remember what I did for you, so now it's your turn. So I would do anything for you, but this I won't do because this guy, blah, 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 you know.
And it's my belief that Joan Cohn, who was Harry Cohn's wife at the time and a friend of Sinatra, again, this is hearsay, that she was very instrumental. She liked Sinatra as a friend, and she went to her husband and said, for crying out loud, give him the part. You know, he wants it. He's tried desperately. He'll work for nothing. And he had studied the script, and he was ready for it, and he tried everything to the best of his ability.
Harry Cohn, he had a stable, racehorses. They were all involved. That was the big thing in those days. L.B. Mayer, everybody had racehorses, and they'd go to the track and elegante, you know.
I don't think Harry Cohn was ever on a horse in his life, which is beside the point. And you know, and often I think I say, how did they cut the head's horse off, and how the hell did they get in the bed without waking him up? So my only conclusion is they must have drugged him, or they put some sleeping potion. He went to sleep, and when he was sleeping, he couldn't be awakened. They brought the head of the horse and put it in, paid off whoever they had to pay off, and left. He wakes up with a horse.
Oh, that's true, yes. It just wasn't a horse's head in the bed. That'd be a little tough to do. You know, I'd wake up, wouldn't you? We suspect somebody walked into the stable and shot Harry Cohn's best horse, you know, right in the head. Boom, bang. Next day, he signed Sinatra.
We know one thing. He was in the film. We know that not only was he in the film, we also know that he got an Academy Award. And from then, it's been nothing but up in the air.
Once you're obligated to these people, you're obligated forever. They may not ever ask you to do something the rest of your life, or may ask you to do something once in your life. But that obligation is always there. You have to pay it. Now, Frank has, I mean, I don't want to sit here and say he's a bad guy because he's one of the most generous, good-hearted people I've ever met in my life.
He was a person who did favors for the mob. In turn, the mob did favors for him. We viewed him as a messenger boy, and that's all we ever viewed Sinatra as being. The favor that he received from the Reagan administration, we believe, was a very damning, very dangerous situation. Because, again, whenever they got together, it's difficult for us to believe that there was some potential for favors to be received by organized crime. Again, it was in the midst of all of this that the investigation of MCA's corruption in the recording industry was killed, that the investigation of the Mafia's penetration of Hollywood was killed. And so we always viewed the Reagan-Sinatra relationship as being extremely nefarious.
I think most people who have studied Sinatra and who have studied the mob would say that Sinatra has more of a fascination with mob. It was almost like the mobsters. It was almost like he wanted to be one, or without actually doing the illegal thing.
Sinatra was asked about those photos of him with organized crime figures.
But I never had anything to do with him business-wise, rarely socially. No connection really whatsoever.
Kirk Douglas spoke of Sinatra's loyalty and generosity. Another witness, actor Gregory Peck.
One of the greatest artists in the popular field in our century, and is one of the finest men and most trustworthy, reliable, truthful men I personally have ever known.
If Mr. Sinatra is a member of the Mafia, then I'm the godfather.
I think he just kind of got a kick out of being around these guys. He's kind of a tough guy, you know, and that's the image he kind of portrays. He just liked being around them. Whether he would ever do anything illegal with them or for them, I don't know. I know that he apparently was partners with Sam Giancana.
Well, the relationship with Frank Sinatra goes back when Frank Sinatra just started to become a popular entertainer. He was with the Dorsey Band in the early mid-30s, and he had a contract with Dorsey, and he would appear around the country.
Yeah, well, I knew Tommy Dorsey, and so I can verify that story. When Sinatra sang for Tommy Dorsey with the Pied Pipers and made his big success, Tommy Dorsey signed him to a contract, 45%. That's pretty, I mean, Tommy was a little dumb to do that. Now, Frank honored that contract. He always paid that 45%. But my God, when, you know, he's out in Hollywood making movies, all the money's going back to Tommy, and his agent's 15%, and publicity's 5%. He was broke all the time. So he called New Jersey, and he called his friends and said, God, what am I going to do? So they went and said, we'll negotiate a new contract. So they went to Tommy Dorsey and said, we think, you know, that's a bad contract. Willie Moretti's people. You know, it's Costello and all those people. And Tommy Dorsey was a little hesitant, and then somebody put a gun out on the table, and then somebody showed him how it worked in your mouth and all that kind of stuff. And Dorsey said, gee, I think you're right. I think we ought to renegotiate the new contract. He said, no, we'll give you $30,000 and buy it out. And that was the end of that.
But he has a lot of problems, you know, problems with business. And things bother him, and sometimes they stay with him. And his attitude shows it sometimes. But he's strong enough. He overcomes a lot of it. You know, one thing, the guy, to me, the man is a little boy yet. Let me tell you why. Any guy's got a hobby is a little boy. Thinks young. Paints, plays with trains. You know, like I do model trucks. You got me on.
Sometimes I wonder why I spend the lonely nights dreaming of a song. The melody haunts my reverie, and I am once again with you.
Hollywood became very leery of any connections, particularly public connections, with anyone that had underworld connections. And that is why when my mother became involved with John Stompanato, she was so terrified that anyone would find out his connections. It was a different world then. It was not the world of the Bugsy Siegel where they were dining with studio heads. Very different world in the 50s.
Mickey Cohen was a bookmaker. You understand?
That was considered legitimate business. But I think they had a little anti-Semitism going, because when they put him in jail, I was sitting in a black barber shop getting a haircut, and the black people just kept in and out, in and out. And I was talking about Mickey Cohen. And I said, isn't it a shame what they're doing to Mickey? And he said, yeah, what is blah, 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 blah. I said, what are these people going in and out of here? Oh, we're booking horses in the back. I said, they don't bother you? He said, no, they just want to get Mickey.
They called him Mickey Mouse, and his men, they called him the Seven Dwarfs. He ran a bookmaking operation in Los Angeles, and of course they figured, the Italian mob figured that they owned the concession. And Mickey was a former boxer, and he came from Cleveland. Now, there's some tough guys in Cleveland. A guy named Polizzi was a sponsor for Mickey, so that kind of kept the edge off of the Los Angeles mob. They had to get permission to kill him, really. So they attempted it.
There's a rumor around town that somebody's posted a bounty on your head. Have you heard about this?
No, I haven't.
Are you much concerned with it?
Not too much.
Do you know of anyone that might bear you any ill will to the extent of placing a bounty on your head?
I don't see why they should. I wouldn't understand why it would be worth anything to anybody to do it.
I mean, Mickey Cohen was kind of a two-bit. He did not travel in the best of circles. He was short and dumpy and kind of bald-headed and a rather nondescript little man, except he had a very loud voice and he made a lot of noise.
One of his men, Stompanato, who was a street collector, a street thug, but a very handsome man. And appealing because of sort of a brute strength, but a very, very handsome man. And he would meet Lana Turner at restaurants around town in Beverly Hills where they all hung out at the Luau. And he got to know Lana Turner.
My mother was someone who had most of her closest friends more among the crew. She was known as, and this was meant complimentary, but with the crew she was known as a good girl, a good old girl, a fun gal. Okay? She related. My mother was never traveled in the top echelon, the snobby echelon, you know. She didn't. She liked to have a good time. And she liked to have people around her who had a good time.
And then Stompanato, who just forced himself on her. He just moved in with her, and she put up with it for whatever reason. And then, of course, then he got involved with the daughter, Cheryl. And the next thing we know, he's dead.
I remember it very clearly, but it's almost today as if I'm watching a motion picture of myself. I have been able to remove, I think, the terrible fear and anguish and sorrow that I felt about that night. I think I've been able to come to terms with those emotions so that I can step back and look at it.
Someone, we're not sure, Cheryl was blamed for it, but we're not sure, someone, might have been Lana Turner, put a knife into Stompanato and broke his major artery, burst, and he died on the spot.
I think the act that happened that night of picking up a knife and defending my mother and myself, because I was as afraid for my life as I was for hers. I mean, he was hurting her physically, but from his words, I was next. A need to survive.
But you must recall, in those days, the studios ran the town. All Lana Turner had to do was call her studio, and they would have had security people over there in 20 minutes rearranging the body, rearranging everything. So nobody's ever really known only what Cheryl says, and she was in shock. They might have told her she did it, you see. She never has ever come out and been able to explain just how she did it.
I did not see her one-on-one for approximately, wasn't quite a week, but it was maybe 4 or 5 days later, because I was taken from the house to the police station to juvenile hall, and I was never allowed to be alone with her. And my recollection of the first time we were together, we put our arms around each other and hugged and cried, but we only talked about what was happening of the moment. And I think I was saying, get me out of here. You know, that kind of a thing. There was no reference to what had happened.
I wanna be loved by you, just you, nobody else but you. I wanna be loved by you.
Well, there's a story of Marilyn, because she obviously was a tremendous celebrity worldwide, and she was really kind of cut down in the prime of life. But her early days in Hollywood began with relationships with the mob.
You know, she was married to Joe DiMaggio. Well, you can imagine, I don't know who her first husband was, but her second husband was Joe DiMaggio, who was most identified Italian at that time. And then she married Arthur Miller, who was a Pulitzer Award winner. Boy, you're really making different steps. And it's just my opinion, she never found a real friend.
As Marilyn's career moved steadily upward through influence from behind the scenes by the mob, she became obviously a tremendous star with Niagara and All About Eve. And at that time, no one needed to help her career along. She had everything going for her. Simultaneously, the CIA saw an opportunity to use her. She was the type of woman who was malleable, who could be manipulated. She needed to feel needed, which is amazing because she was so wanted by everybody.
Imagine, you know, being alone in the room all by yourself. Because imagine if you walked down Broadway, it would be like an Eisenhower parade. And apparently she'd be despondent. I really don't think she had any really intention to overdose herself in pills. I just think it was just, she lost contact, you know, her whereabouts of what she was doing. Because I found her to be a gracious gal. And
now you add in the fact that she gets involved with Jack Kennedy, she gets involved with Robert Kennedy, and she has relations with the mob as well as with the CIA. She becomes a very dangerous individual. When she said, I'm going to blow the lid off this entire thing, she was not referring just to her relationship with Robert Kennedy or Jack Kennedy, which would have been sensational, but it was really going to be, look at what our government has been doing behind the scenes.
Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, Mr. President. Happy birthday to you. Everybody, happy birthday.
We now know that the Kennedy brothers had relationships with the sex goddess of the 60s, Marilyn Monroe, and that Jimmy Hoffa was trying to get evidence against the Kennedys and had a man by the name of Spindell recording meetings between Marilyn Monroe and the Kennedy brothers, secretly recording them because of an electronic bug put in the house.
I just don't know what Marilyn Monroe was used for. I tell you this, I do not believe for a second, not for a second, that the Kennedy brothers had anything to do with her death. I don't believe that for a second. As to whether the Mafia clipped her or whether, I mean, I am under the impression now, as I have always been under the impression, that this woman was very troubled and that she committed suicide. And I have seen no evidence to convince me of anything to the contrary.
Now, they could have chosen any time they wanted to kill Marilyn Monroe. But why did they choose the very day, the very evening that Bobby Kennedy was there? And that was the result of Sam Giancana's real motivation was it was one thing to accept the contract and to kill Marilyn Monroe, but what he wanted to do was expose the relationship between Bobby and Marilyn. And it was a tremendous opportunity for him, given that Bobby was there that evening. They helped sedate her because she was so upset that if they murdered her on that evening, it would almost look like Bobby Kennedy may have actually murdered her.
As to her mob associations, that may well have been true. But I know that a lot of what's being represented right now is irresponsible disinformation, and to allege that the Kennedy brothers had anything to do with her murder is just simply untrue.
She was sedated, and shortly before midnight, the assassins from Chicago got into the home, and they had rubber gloves on. She was already sedated, so she struggled but was not in any position to resist. They taped her mouth, put her on the bed. She was nude, and they forced a suppository, a specially doctored Nembutal suppository that included barbiturates and chlorohydrates. Once they administered the suppository, it dissolved, went right into the membrane, right into the bloodstream, and there was no way to save her, unlike putting pills down her throat, which could have bruised her face, could have resulted in vomiting. It was the perfect way to kill Marilyn Monroe, because even if the medical team got to her, they could not save her because it was within her bloodstream. It was not in her stomach. And as a result, they were successful. And Marilyn Monroe then was eliminated and was no longer a threat to the mob and to the CIA, as well as to the Kennedys.
Bye-bye, baby. Remember, you're my baby. When they give you the eye.
Well, it's been rumored for years that there has been a connection with the MCA and the mob. Prosecutors throughout the years have been trying to prove that for indictment purposes and beyond a reasonable doubt. We had conducted an investigation to try to determine if the mob was involved in some manner, shape, or form with MCA.
There was a movie that De Laurentiis had done called The Brinks Job, which was completely financially backed by the underworld. There were a number of other situations that the De Laurentiis had been involved in where organized crime was directly involved. I mean, this is not a new phenomenon to De Laurentiis or to the motion picture industry as a whole. I mean, the Mafia's penetration of Hollywood has existed throughout the century, and it continues to this day.
There was a wiretap affidavit that was publicly disclosed sometime in 1989, I believe, concerning one of the former top executives of MCA, Eugene Giaquinto. That wiretap affidavit seemed to indicate that Mr. Giaquinto had organized crime associations with one Edward Chandra, the underboss of the Buffalino family.
To all intents and purposes, that investigation was killed by the Justice Department because of this incredible sweetheart relationship between Hollywood and the studios and the federal government of the United States. Basically, prosecutors are not permitted to investigate these allegations of corruption within the motion picture industry when they involve major motion picture studios, such as MCA. Specifically, the MCA investigation was killed by the Justice Department itself, leading to the firing of one honest prosecutor by the name of Marvin Rudnick, and leading to the resignation and frustration of another honest prosecutor by the name of Richard Staben.
It was revealed that there were 2 and possibly 3 projects in various stages concerning the life of Meyer Lansky. And it appeared that there were 2 different organized crime families that might have had some type of an interest in each project. They were the Gambino family from New York City and the Genovese family from New York City. And it appears, and again, historically it appears, that when one does a movie about the mob in America, that the mob usually in some manner participates in the movie.
The problem is that there are 12 affidavits spelling out these wiretaps, which were sealed by the court. One of the affidavits was leaked out somehow and fell into the hands of me and a couple other people in the world of journalism. But the other 11 remain sealed. But we do know that those wiretaps include threats by the participants, the targets of the investigation, to use their influence with Ed Meese and Ronald Reagan to quash this investigation. But we do know that the investigation itself was quashed, and we believe for strictly political reasons, because the evidence was there and it was being pursued honestly and faithfully by Richard Staven, who was heading that investigation for the strike force against organized crime in L.A.
All right, cut. How is it? Everything's okay. Tate? Yes, sir. I want to set up now on the reverse angle of this same scene. Trucking shot.